A lot of people have a very strong impression that Australia has no literary culture, whatever that means, that we've produced no classics, whatever that means, and that generally we are a society that does not write, does not produce any sort of workable or sort of worthy prose, that generally sticks to the visual medium and the musical medium if we make any art at all. That's not quite true, and I have several examples to the contrary in front of me. Australia actually has quite a rich literary tradition. It's just that it's very hard to find. It's not very popular overseas. I think part of the reason for that is that throughout all of these books that I'm going to talk about in uneven length, and a few others that I've got off camera beside me, which I may or may not talk about, there's this very strong tradition of absurdism and of kind of strangeness, and it kind of transitions from something I would almost call Gothic into something extremely self-aware and extremely technical and sort of very tired, very cynical literature. So you can imagine why it might not be very popular, quite aside from the fact that a lot of the world doesn't really believe that this country exists. So I thought we might sort of have a go at going through these in order and watching as they slowly go from the very British to the very American to something that it could have been Australian if any country were interested at this point in producing a uniquely Australian style of literature. So we'll start with Unemployed at Last. We'll start with Such is Life by Joseph Furphy and Kenneth Mackenzie's Young Desire It. These are both published by Text Classics, which was a publishing house started in, I think, the 70s. Let me check that. Hold on. Oh, I'm wrong. It's 1990 by the visionary Diana Gribble. Anyway, at some point in the past couple decades it was begun, just to preserve these kind of older Australian books, and also take note of new ones, which might be worth preserving too. So you'll see that this is from the 70s as well, you know. And I have a whole bunch of these. Hold on a moment. Just because there are so many old Australian books that were very much forgotten by our culture, and though I don't know the full story, I assume Diana Gribble felt that there was worth in them and wanted to preserve them. So it's quite hard for me to hold all of these. Hold on. Look at these. You can take those names down if you want. I haven't actually read any of these. They're in a separate pile. I'm planning to get around to them. But I assume they can't be all that bad because, I mean, these ones, really, really good. But anyway, we'll get on with what we were talking about. This kind of very early English stage of the literature when Australia's culture was very much under the imperial yoke, you know. This book was written and published around the turn of the century, so we'd only just been federated. So as you can imagine, it's got this very English sort of mindset to it. But it's a book that's uniquely Australian, just because if we look closely, this is a very modern book, you know. It's been called Australia's Moby Dick, Such is Life, which the words which are most famously and apocryphally, I might add, the famous last words of Ned Kelly. And this book combines this very high-handed English prose with an extremely, occasionally very difficult to decipher Australian vernacular. So if we look at a page like this, you know, I'll leave you to compare the prose with the actual speech on this page. You can pause the video, you know, scroll about, and you can see what kind of book it is from a page like that, you know. It alternates between this very dense narration, which is, by the way, Tom Collins, the main character of this novel, is an unreliable narrator, and the very dense style of narration in what are purported to be his memoirs is purposely a very dense style because he wants to hide things, especially, and this is perhaps what makes the book most British, how he feels about what's going on. So it's that kind of book. It's about a bullock driver in, you know, early federated Australia, and it goes into a great many of the social problems and questions of that time. And it really is probably the best thing this country's ever produced, but nobody had ever heard of it. So I thought we'd start off just by bringing some attention to that. And then there's Kenneth Mackenzie's Young Desire. I didn't like this one quite so much. It's this sort of very dense, sort of coming-of-age novel. Again, very English. It's got that sort of English private school vibe about it. Because, of course, the character is a young man going to it's that, and he's getting that very classic British education where they had to learn Greek and Latin and the classics and all the rest of it. And sort of, it's the Catholic education, fire and brimstone and the whip across the hand, all of that sort of stuff. So it's extremely English. There's not very much that was Australian about this at all. And that's why it kind of came at the beginning of, I suppose, of the timeline. Although actually it's from 1937. When I read it, I thought it was 100 years older than that, but just because it's so unerringly British. Anyway, whoa, I'm knocking the camera around. I shouldn't do that. Next up, I just finished this recently. David Ireland's Unknown Industrial Prisoner, which is a book from the 70s, which deals a lot with sort of alienation and the rise of corporatism and the sort of increasing superfluity of man in a mechanized environment. And it's kind of this big mix of Australian identities. If you read this, here, we'll pull up an example. The whole book is this sort of very journalistic and very obviously personal account, because David Ireland worked in an oil refinery, and that is what the book is about. It's about a whole bunch of people working in an oil refinery and basically being displaced by capitalism and pretty awful working practices. You can really sense as you go through this book that so much of it is just drawn directly from his experience that I would be totally unsurprised if about half of this text was just a memoir with the names changed. But the way it's structured is very much like Andre Belly's Petersburg, in that it's a series of sort of short vignettes with a bunch of sort of strange headings. And I'll note, just before we move on from this book, that no characters have actual proper names. Everybody's got a nickname, because, of course, that's the point. They're all alienated, and they're all sort of anonymous to each other. They're all replaceable. It doesn't really matter who you are, because 5 minutes after working at the place, you'll have a new name anyway. You'll be called something like, where is it? The Wandering Jew, the Whispering Baritone. I'll see if I can find, but if I can't, I'll just list a few. You've got the Kraut, you've got Herman the German, the Glass Canoe, Faraway Places. A lot of the names refer to, the Western Salesman, there he is. One Eye, the Brown Snake, which, by the way, is a nickname for the Brisbane River. So I don't know why he's called that. But anyway. But a lot of those nicknames are meant to signify faraway places and things that are just outside of all of their experience, So there's a samurai, there's faraway places, Glass Canoe, a sort of spectral method of escape. It's this very elusive method of saying that underneath all of the cynicism and the kind of Canada Dry, underneath all of the sort of cynicism and horrible things, they still have this kind of sarcastic hope. And this is actually, that's quite Australian, because I feel like that's the way that things are right now in this country. The thing about Australia, or at least I'll tell you about the inner city, what it's sort of culturally like to just be here. And I'll start rambling about that, because why on earth not, What it's like to be here is that everybody believes that they're all very laid back and very sort of, how would you put this, outgoing and casual about things. But actually, whenever something bad happens, people tend to get very stressed. And people tend to take things very seriously, and they tend to worry about them. But at the same time, if you take stuff seriously around here, you're seen as an idiot, and you look pretentious. And we have a very, very severe case of tall poppy syndrome in this country. And as far as I can tell, I mean, the Queensland Writers' Centre is just sort of an absolute joke, And that's sort of meant to be the one-stop shop. But you can really see that there's this streak of absurdism, especially not so much in Kenneth Mackenzie, because that's basically a British novel. Much more so in this, much more so in this, much more so in this. Gerald Murnane is somebody who gets talked about a lot more often now, and this is a very interesting book because this is this sort of book from the inside out, as you might be able to tell from the title. I actually read it a while ago, so I'll have to reread it. I don't have too much to say about this, but I do remember it being well worth checking out. So hey, if you're interested, you might want to start here. It's very short as well. And David Marlouf, who I think is the only Australian author whose books I actually own, who was mentioned by Harold Bloom in his big old list of Western canon books. Not that I'm too obsessed with what Harold Bloom thinks, but, you know, as long as you can get a notch on that belt, I think that's pretty good. But David Marlouf, I think, is also the only author here who is from Brisbane, and who wrote about Brisbane in his first and most famous book, Jono, which is kind of like Zorba the Greek, except far more depressing, far shorter, and about Brisbane instead of Crete. Much more interesting, and this is the one that Harold Bloom actually picked him up for, is An Imaginary Life, which is about the metamorphosis of Ovid. So it's not Ovid's metamorphosis, as in the metamorphoses written, you know, made into poetry by Ovid. It's about the change of the poet Ovid, exiled to, was it Romania? I think it was Romania. It's about him changing in exile into something else, confronted with barbarians. This is I think this is actually much better than this. Everyone in this country goes mad about Jono, but actually An Imaginary Life is a much better book. And then we move on about 2 decades into the future with Greg Egan. Greg Egan, a science fiction author who started writing in the 90s, who never shows his face. Nobody knows what he looks like. There are no pictures of him on the internet. This is something that Greg Egan himself has said. If you Google my name and a face appears, as it no doubt will, because, I mean, Greg Egan, you know, you're going to get a face if you type that in. Everybody's called Greg Egan. That will not be his face, so he says. And this is where Australian literature kind of melds into a form that I know rather well, because I have noticed that nowadays Australians place a great value on the technical aspects of writing, and not in the sense of sort of the quality of the prose and so on, although that is kind of, you know, that's known to be important, but in the sense that we like to write things that deal with technical matters in a very specific way. Australians, when they write, like to get really into the sort of the fetish of the thing, as I've defined it elsewhere on this channel, you know, into the heart of the thing, and kind of explore all of the possible permutations of that thing. So Greg Egan, actually, I think he's a qualified scientist of some kind, and I know he's written actual scientific papers on, you know, all of this sort of very high-minded physics stuff that I don't quite understand. But I can give you another example as well that I saw a few years ago. I read a bit of a few years ago, Melissa Ashley's Birdman's Wife, which was about the wife of a famous, not botanist, a zoologist who was working for the British, basically the Biological Gardens or whatever the organization used to be called, and who was just making, what would you call them? Extremely detailed anatomical drawings of birds, the Birdman's Wife. And she was the one who kind of helped him in his work. And the whole book was about her sort of, you know, the power of woman behind the scenes and all of that sort of stuff. But it dealt with her whole life through the sort of prism of the drawings of the birds and so on. It was this very technically minded book all about taxidermy and about the preservation of the natural wildlife and all of this sort of stuff. And it was pretty good. But I noticed this, and I lent, not this book, another Greg Egan, a different Greg Egan book, to somebody else. And the first thing they said to me when they gave it back was, I feel like he's just showing off what he knows about all of the science that's in this book. And I thought, you know, that's true. When Australian people write nowadays, one of the things that we seem to like to do is just show off how much we know. I think that's pretty well exemplified, not just by Permutation City. I've got a few of his other books here as well. Where are they? Schild's Ladder. This one was pretty good. Distress, not so good. This one was less focused on the science and more on the sort of human aspect, which is all right, but I feel like he does the science stuff better. And that's, best done here and here. And so that's those. If you're interested in Greg Egan after that, I've also read his short story collection, Axiomatic. It's pretty good, that. And so we move on to kind of the final one that I've got here. And this is Their Brilliant Careers, Ryan O'Neill, published by Black Ink, who have also, they might be worth checking out if you want more Australian literature, because they've done this collection, same mark, and Ryan O'Neill, somewhere in here, there's another story by him as well. So I'm looking forward to digging into all of those. Anyway, Their Brilliant Careers is a spoof of Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career, which you'll notice I didn't drag out for this video, partly because I don't own it, and partly because that's one of the only Australian books that people actually know about, so I didn't really see the point of talking about it. But anyway, this is 16 totally true biographies. There's no fiction here at all, As incredible as it may sound, everything that's written in this book is 100% true, and nothing anyone tells me will convince me otherwise. All right, okay. So yeah, it's 16 fake biographies, and yeah, it's pretty creative stuff. There's all sorts of satires in here. There's these sorts of very right-wing, very left-wing, very strange. It goes through the 20th century in Australian literature in this totally off-the-wall, backwards way, and winds, and also note this. We'll get to this. I'm sure some of you know what this means. As you go on, all of their sort of 16 stories kind of start to entwine together, and each of them makes more sense, because they all interact and talk with each other. Obviously, they're inspired by each other and so on. And the first time I read this book, about halfway through, I just realized that I'd been totally sucked in. And even though I'd already read that, it was obviously not true, and I knew it was obviously not true from about the second sentence, I still found myself almost believing it. Just because what's in here is so thoroughly human, even though it is, this ridiculous sort of postmodern novel where Ryan O'Neill himself appears in the end and pretends that his wife is one of the novelists, And, all right, I guess, unless you read it, there's not much else that we can really talk about, so I'll skip straight to Vivian Darkbloom. Vivian Darkbloom is Vladimir Nabokov's anagram for his own name. So it's a kind of alter ego. And Vivian Darkbloom is presented in this book as a real person who is married to Pnin, as in from the Nabokov's book Pnin, and who is a close friend of Vladimir Nabokov. And it makes up all of this stuff about, Vivian Darkbloom, self-proclaimed muse, was born in Parramatta, New South Wales. It's really very funny, And you can really tell that Ryan O'Neill is absolutely in love with literature, the way he references things constantly. I mean, look at these. Going throughout this book, she's not one of the 16, major novelists, but there's a sort of another brilliant story going on in the background here about another one who writes children's versions of classics. So you have The Magic Pudding by Norman Lindsay, A Child's Jane Eyre by Naomi Plume. And there was another mention of Naomi Plume, who's this sort of crypto story working in the background as well. I'm not going to find it. It'll take me too long, but I'll just say Naomi Plume is reportedly the author of A Child's Finnegan's Wake and A Child's The Secret History by Procopius, which is the most ridiculous thing If you've ever read either of those, I mean, that's just absolutely stupid. But oh, it's well worth picking up. All of these. Good places to start. Perhaps not so much this one. I mean, it's good. It's just not really, it's not as good. But yeah, text classics, black ink. I should mention a couple of other names just while we're here, because I'm probably never going to talk about Australian stuff again, let's be real. Unless specific examples crop up, more like this. But I'll go through a few names that some people might be hoping to see in a video like this. So there's obviously Randolph Stone. Classic. Haven't read this yet. Been told it's good by many people. Getting around to it. Nick Cave. And yeah, that is the same Nick Cave as the guy who did The Good Son. Weird, absurdist, modern Australian fiction. He also wrote one called The Ass and the Angel, which my brother has, and I'm going to pick up eventually. And obviously Patrick White. Who else is there? There's Peter Carey. I've only read one book by Peter Carey, and it was not The True History of the Kelly Gang, which I've heard great things about. It was Oscar and Lucinda, which, again, while it's not quite so much as... Oh, where is he? While it's not quite so fetishistic as Greg Egan, still kind of relies quite a bit on its technical knowledge in sort of glass making and in the practices of the Catholic Church. And it wasn't the Catholic Church, was it? It was one of the Christian churches in Australia, sort of during the colonial period. So that's Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda. That was pretty good, I will have to say. It was quite good. So I guess the point that I was trying to make with this video was basically that while we may appear to be, Australia is not quite the literary wasteland that it may seem on the outside. Although, also Voss, by the way, I've been told is Patrick White's best book. But we are not quite the literary wasteland we appear to be on the outside, although, I mean, many of the people who live here won't do anything not to convince you of that fact. I think I'm one of the very, very few people I know who actually knows about most of these books' existence, despite living here, it's quite a sad thing. I guess there's nothing I can do about it but make this video and, I suppose more like it if I find more. But yeah, it's quite an interesting, absurd literary culture down here, and I think part of the reason why it is the way it is, why it is like this, is precisely because we're surrounded by people who only care about the sports ball, and Friday night with the lads and so on. That's why this is the way it is. I mean, I can't think of... Australia went from a British colony to a culturally American colony. Most of the people I talk to on the street will know more about American politics, American history, American literature, American television than they'll know about anything Australian, because all of our cultural output to any great degree has basically been outsourced to everywhere else. So it makes stuff like this hard to find, which is more the pity, because, as I've said multiple times, it's really, really good. And that's really all I've got to say about that.